everyone. Since it's officially 10 o'clock, thank you everybody for signing in and attending the election payroll event virtually. We have invited both auditors and clerks. So you guys are going to be with us for the next hour and a half discussing those election payroll questions that you have and maybe some things you didn't know. We have Michael Roker. He's the attorney with counties. He's my partner. And then me, Stacy Burns. I just reposted in the chat the Q&R code link. Mike, would you like to start sharing your screen so that if there's two people in the room, you guys can either fill out the link twice, or Mike is going to share his screen and show you the QR code if you would like to scan this QR code as well. Did everyone see what I posted in the chat, and then also see the slides on the screen? Okay, perfect. So please fill out the QR code. This will be recorded. Like I was just saying, when some of you maybe enter the call at 10 o'clock, we will record this. It will be posted to our YouTube channel, and I will be sending out a link through Microsoft Cloud. So if for some reason you are not getting notices through email from our office, please go in and subscribe on our website to the county's emails. We only send out information that you need, like call letters, presentations, notices for this event, the training materials, because the training materials are not on our website any longer with ADA requirements. So we need to make sure that you guys are getting the information prior to conference. If anybody has questions, please use the chat feature, and I will stop Mike as he's presenting, and he will stop me. Mike, do you have anything to say before we kind of get started?
Nope. Just feel free to interrupt us at any point with questions, and we'll jump on them as fast as we can. So pop them into the chat.
So, yeah, Mike, I'm just going to turn off my camera. If you want, you can leave yours on or turn it off, but I'll turn off my camera and my microphone, and I'll let you take it away, okay?
Great. I'm going to turn my camera off too, so everybody can focus on the presentation. So it's nice to meet everybody who, if I don't know you, hopefully I will get to know you soon. I am Stacy's new partner, as she mentioned. I am not Ricky, but I guess I am kind of the new Ricky if you guys knew her from before when Stacy and Ricky worked together so well for so many years. So today we're going to talk about election payroll. We've got a little bit of an agenda. I'm going to talk about hiring election workers. I'm going to talk about types of election workers, election budgets, who is working on election day and leading up to election day. And then I'm going to turn the presentation over to Stacy. She's going to talk about taxes related to election workers, payments for services, and then also IRS reporting requirements, how you do reporting for election workers. So we're going to go through all those topics. Let's just jump right in. The first thing we're going to talk about is hiring election workers, which is one of the beginning steps in this process before you can pay them. Before we can do that, I'm going to talk about employee definitions. So this is a complicated legal space. I say that to you as a person who has dealt with the distinction between employees and independent contractors in a lot of different contexts during my time as an attorney. An employee in the broadest sense is a person who is hired into a job, hired into a specific job, whereas an independent contractor provides services to an entity as a non-employee. Now, the distinction between these two things is just so incredibly complicated depending on the context that we're talking about. This distinction between independent contractors and employees comes up in so many different ways. It comes up in the context of access to certain legal regimes like the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, unemployment compensation, workers' compensation protections. There are all sorts of other contexts, right? Whether or not the employer has to withhold Medicare and Social Security on the employer side, the employer's contribution portion. This is going to depend on whether you have an employee or an independent contractor in a lot of contexts. And certainly, of course, it's going to depend on that as well. in terms of civil liability. So if you have somebody who causes harm to a third party, one of employers' favorite arguments to make in terms of avoiding liability is to say, well, that person wasn't my employee, that person was an independent contractor. And there are all kinds of different legal tests for determining whether somebody qualifies as an employee or an independent contractor in different contexts. So this distinction really is important, right? Who's covered by various employment and labor laws? What are the requirements in terms of employment taxes and benefits? Now, we have some traditional markers for this distinction between employees and independent contractors. Usually we like to say, hey, an employee gets a W-2, an independent contractor gets a 1099. Now, it's useful, or in my head, I like to think of these as the two silos that exist, the two buckets that every single person exists inside of. Either you have an employee or you have an independent contractor in every case. But as we're going to see with folks like election workers, it's not quite so clear. Election workers are really sort of in their own category. They're not independent contractors in every context. They're not employees in every context. So we're going to have to sort of think of election workers as existing in their own bucket, their own category, separate from either of these traditional distinctions. Okay, so election workers are a specialized group of individuals hired by a county to perform services in connection with elections. The IRS has very specific guidelines for election workers and when their compensation is reported and when withholdings are needed. There are complicated ways to calculate this. Stacy is going to talk about that when she gets to taxes and IRS reporting requirements towards the end of the presentation. We've taken information from the IRS's website for purposes of this presentation, but it's important that I mention that Stacy and I do not speak for the IRS. So if you get into a really complicated situation and you need guidance that's specifically from the IRS, you're going to have to speak to them directly. We've copied the link here for the IRS website as it pertains to election workers and reporting and withholding requirements. I find that website to be quite helpful for the majority of situations you're going to encounter. I would recommend using this link and reviewing the information on the website. Take a look at it. The IRS has done a good job here of breaking down sort of the basics. I do want to point out, though, especially for you auditors on this call, it is important to follow IRS guidelines. If you get audited by the IRS, and though it's not super common, counties have been audited by the IRS, and the IRS discovers that there is non-compliance, there can be penalties that are assessed against the county. Really, I say the county, but it could be any local unit of government. But in the context of election workers, it is going to be the county. So compensation has to be paid in a manner that's going to facilitate compliance with state and federal reporting requirements when we're talking about election workers. If there's some kind of significant error and that results in a penalty being charged to the county, there are times that can fall back on the elected official who is responsible for that error. Now, I'm not saying that because I want to frighten anybody or scare anybody. It's just really a long way of saying that these requirements are important, right? You need to be following these rules. There can be real world consequences if you don't follow the rules. So the IRS can take a look at you. I do want to talk briefly about Indiana Code 3-6-6-37, which talks about certain election workers, most election workers really being independent contractors. This is a provision of state law, and it reads, I'm just going to read the relevant part of it. When the county appoints a precinct election officer and the individual accepts the appointment by swearing the oath of office, a contract is created between the county and the individual in which the county retains the services of the election worker as an independent contractor. So the real important language there is state code is describing these folks as independent contractors. Now, to be clear, state code can't supersede federal law. So things like the IRS code are going to supersede this particular provision of the Indiana code. And as we'll see, the IRS code is going to describe, in some ways, election workers more like employees than independent contractors. It's going to require W-2 reporting for certain election workers. So, we're really talking about here with Indiana Code 3-6-6-37, What we're really talking about is access to certain state level considerations. For those state level considerations, election workers are going to be considered independent contractors. In certain other ways, compensation for election workers, it does fall under the county's budget and the county salary ordinances. So even if the positions are considered independent contractors, they don't look like your traditional independent contractors. So if you think of like a law firm that you might hire where the lawyer who's doing the work is an independent contractor, there is going to be some level of negotiation between the lawyer who you're hiring or maybe the accountant that you're hiring and the county about what their hourly rate is going to be. Maybe it's a per project fee. You're going to negotiate that per project fee or shop around. With election workers, it doesn't work like that, right? The commissioners are going to set the per diem that these folks are paid. It's going to appear in the salary ordinance. And then that's going to be the amount they get paid. There's no negotiation like there would be in other contexts. So, again, we see this sort of strange world that election workers live in. They're not really independent contractors. They're not exactly employees. We have to think of them as a separate thing, fitting into a separate bucket that's sort of unique to them. Okay. In that context, when you're hiring election workers, what does that look like? Well, first and foremost, one of the questions that I've seen the most related to election workers, probably the most related to election workers, is about onboarding requirements. There is no need for election workers to be onboarded. They are a special group of workers. They're hired solely for the election process. They do need to be trained by the election board on their election duties, but they're not seasonal or temporary employees of a county. Some counties, they hire a lot of seasonal or temporary employees, maybe in the summertime when they have additional duties that they need to perform. These aren't seasonal or temporary employees like that. They're more like independent contractors than employees in this way. So there's no need to go through the onboarding process or new employee training. They shouldn't have to listen to information on benefits and pensions or personnel policies. I see a question in the chat asking about internal control training. That's not required either. I'll talk more about that in a second. And this is the case regardless of how much the election worker is going to get paid, how many days they're going to work as an election worker. And it's the case whether or not they receive compensation in excess of any of the thresholds that Stacy's going to talk about later on in the chat. No matter what, they don't need to be onboarded. They don't need to be treated like employees in this way. And again, there's absolutely no need, as I just said, for an election worker to have to be trained on internal controls. Just as an added note that isn't really relevant here, but not every single county employee is legally required to have internal control training. A lot of folks do that training for everybody just because they want to make sure they're covering their bases. But under Indiana Code 511-127, which is the statute that requires the internal control training, only those personnel whose official duties include receiving, possessing, depositing, or otherwise having access to funds of the political subdivision need to be trained on internal controls. So that's not everybody. If you see election workers on election day accepting dollars from somebody, you should be super alarmed. They shouldn't be touching cash. You should call the police. You shouldn't call us. But this is not a training that's required for election workers, just to be clear. Yeah, I see a question related to background checks and pre-employment drug screening for regular employees. Again, those are likely part of your standard onboarding process. The State Board of Accounts isn't going to offer an opinion on whether or not you need to do that. That's going to be up to you. Again, we wouldn't expect to see that sort of thing, the sort of normal onboarding process for people who are working on election day, for people who are election workers, but that's going to be up to you. Okay, so really, when we're talking about what type of training election workers are going to receive before they're performing their duties, we're really talking about training by the election board. That's really the only training that these folks need. They don't need to know about paid time off. They're not going to earn any paid time off from the county. They don't need to know about the county policies for employees or read or understand or sign off on the employee handbook for the county. If there are any policies that might be relevant from the county, those election workers can be made aware of those as part of the election board training. That's when they can do it. Yeah, so I see a question from Amy about onboarding not being required for count for all county employees, but commenting that the county might have gotten dinged because not all election workers had signed forms for internal controls. Stacy, I see you unmute. Were you going to jump in on that one?
Yeah, Amy, I'm assuming that's probably a written comment. I'm gonna go pull that and see how it was written and kind of go into the project and look. I want to see why you were dinged for it because, again, they don't touch cash, so I don't understand why you would have been. So let me do some more research on that and we'll get back with you, okay?
Yeah, that doesn't sound consistent with the guidance that we've given. So I appreciate you digging into that, Stacy. Um, Yeah, again, Heather, the question I think is about even for early workers doing background. That's correct. Yeah, there we don't if it's just an election worker, even if they're doing early voting, we are not going to look at them as being required to do any of the standard onboarding stuff. Again, the real answer to the question that came up earlier was whether or not we would require it or whether it would just be up to the county. It really is up to the county, but that's not something we would expect to see. I see a question from, got a few questions in the chat now from Destry. You have to use the people that the county chairs have appointed to those positions. You do not run background checks or drug screenings. If you have an issue, you need to talk with your Republican or Democratic chairs about who appoint the poll workers. Yeah, so for some of the poll workers who are appointed that way, that's right. Um, okay, a question from Paula. So if I'm understanding this correctly, HR does not need to be part of their onboarding training, just maybe payroll if we offer direct deposit with payroll W-2 process. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right, Paula. Um,
Yeah,
there
you're
may be
right.
you're going to have to do, there are probably going to be some payroll forms that are required. But other than that, probably HR does not need to be part of their onboarding or training. And that's maybe going to be difficult for some folks. And I'm saying this as a lawyer who loves consistent processes across the board. But that's going to be something that probably counties aren't used to. And frankly, all local governments aren't used to. All right, I'm going to jump on to the next slide now. Types of election workers. So we have to talk about the different types of election workers that exist. Now, I'm going to run through these pretty fast because these are broad categories. They're not super relevant for our considerations in this training today. But we do have the code citations there for you. So if you want to reference these, if you have questions about them, you can go back to this presentation and sort of see where in the Indiana code these folks are described. Okay, so election workers for absentee voting. We have absentee voter board members. You've got the code citation there. For these folks, we have two board members. They're going to be from each party, and they're going to oversee voter procedures, absentee voter procedures. They get a per diem. Their per diem is set by the county council, and they also are entitled to a mileage reimbursement. There are also absentee ballot counter and absentee couriers. Their per diem, by contrast, is set by the county commissioners. Again, you've got the code citation there, so it's not set by the county council. But there's some for mileage reimbursement is set by the county council, just like absentee voter board members. There are election workers on election day. So here we're talking about probably those people who, when the general public thinks of who qualifies as a poll worker, what does it mean to be a poll worker? These are the people they're really talking about. These are the faces that voters see on election day at their polling place. So we're talking about inspectors, poll judges, poll clerks, poll assistant clerks, poll sheriffs. They're defined by 3-6-6-25. And these are the same folks who were covered by that statute I read earlier, 3-6-6-37, that says that certain poll workers are independent contractors. Their per diem is fixed by the county commissioners. Now, I did mention earlier that we would expect to see that per diem reflected also in the county council's salary ordinance. Again, it's just going to be reflected there. It's the commissioners who have the authority to set the per diem. The same with vote center workers, right? Their per diem is fixed by the county commissioners. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these individuals, for state law purposes, are considered independent contractors. That does not mean that they're independent contractors for every single purpose. I know I've hammered that point home here. I'm really beating a dead horse, but they are considered by state statute to be independent contractors of the election board. And then we have the county election board itself. Their compensation is set by the county council. We really don't get a lot of issues related to the county election board. We just wanted to make sure you understood that it's the county council that sets the compensation for the county election board. They also get to set a reasonable rate of compensation for the canvas clerical assistant, if you have one, and the write-in counting team. And then the provisional ballot center also receives a per diem that's set by the county fiscal body. That's the county council, is the county fiscal body. Okay, not seeing any questions in the chat. I do want to do a quick broad sweep of how elections are paid for. So I do want to talk about election budgets briefly. This is complicated. It's going to involve not just the State Board of Accounts. In fact, it's not going to involve the State Board of Accounts very much at all. It's really going to be more in the Department of Local Government Finances space. But we do want to talk about it briefly because it's a little bit different than everything else. Not really significantly, but slightly. First off, the election budget is, well, first off, let's say Indiana Code 6-1.1-18-4 requires that all expenditures in the county cannot exceed the approved budget. So that goes for the election budget too. The council has to approve the overall budget for the county. That includes the budget for elections. And then the budget has to be approved by the Department of Local Government Finance. I'm sure for all of you auditors on this call, that's going to be something you are overly familiar with. The budget has to be advertised to the public. Once the budget is advertised, the budget can't exceed the amount that was advertised. Now, you can do an additional appropriation, so you can add money to the budget if that's necessary, but that also has to be advertised, approved by the county council, and approved by the Department of Local Government Finance. The approval by the Department of Local Government Finance is going to depend on the fund balance, so any dollars you have available, and then any estimated revenues to the fund. So if there's not sufficient cash or additional revenue, the DLGF, the Department of Local Government Finance, is not going to approve the additional appropriations. So there are limited resources to pay operating expenses, and the budget is how those limited resources are going to be allocated throughout the entire county, and that includes for elections, right? When I used to work in local government, those general fund dollars that could be used for any purpose were so precious. Everybody would try to get their hands on them. And that is, I think, still the case. So when you're thinking about funding your election, it's going to be part of that sort of general fund, those dollars that everybody wants to get their hands on. The second part of budget work by the council includes determining compensation amounts for positions where the council sets the compensation. Now, for most poll workers, the majority of them are probably going to receive that per diem that's set by the county commissioners, but does still appear in the salary ordinance. But we specified earlier who sets what salaries for which folks. You can refer back to those slides that we just went over a second ago if you need to know who's setting what salaries. Now, that's going to be important because if you want to make changes to compensation for various election workers, you need to make sure you're having the correct body do that, whether that's the county council, whether that's the commissioners, or whether or not that is the election board. It's going to depend on who you're doing that with. So quickly going over the process. So the election board's budget itself under 3-6-5-16 is going to be set by the election board. So they're going to prepare an annual budget, itemizing expenditures, and they're going to submit the budget estimate. Really, I think what we're talking about more is the election board's budget, right? The commissioners are going to prepare an itemized estimate under 36257 of all money to be drawn by the members of the executive and all expenditures to be made. So as part of that estimate that the commissioners are going to prepare, now we're looking at the middle dark blue slide, that's going to include the amount required for election expenses. So when I think about preparing the election budget, that's really going to fall within the broad scope of the commissioners. That's something they do. I do see somebody mentioning, Patty's mentioning that the clerks set the election budget instead of the commissioners. I think in the broadest sense, it's going to be like most of the county's budget, though. Election expenses really should be. The commissioners are going to make choices about how to recommend to the council allocating those scarce resources, and that's going to include paying for budgets. Let's see. If the commissioners set those rates, is that in the ordinance or the minutes? So I think Jennifer's asking if the commissioners set the per diem for poll workers or for those folks who they're required to set rates for, is that going to appear in the ordinance or the minutes? I would expect it to be in both, frankly. You're talking to a lawyer and an accountant today. So we are going to always caution over documenting. So I think it should appear in the minutes, but then also I would recommend that it appear in the salary ordinance. The salary ordinance is going to be the place that our field examiners might look to see that those payments are consistent with what the county adopted. That's going to be the first place they look. That's also going to be, if you're a member of the public, the salary ordinance is where you're going to look if you're going to try to figure out who the county is paying and how much they're paying them. So my recommendation would be to put it in both the commissioner's minutes and also in the salary ordinance itself. Okay, and then of course, the last step in the budget process, as we mentioned already, is for the county council to take a look at the recommendations from the election board and from the county commissioners and to go ahead and adopt that budget. Ultimately, the county council is the fiscal body, and they're going to have to adopt the budget and how much and determine how much is actually spent. They get the final say in it. Okay, so this is really just a review. We talked about this a second ago. Which board sets compensation for which employees? So if we're talking about the county council, they set the compensation for the election board and absentee vote workers. Again, a couple slides up, you can see the same information. If we're talking about the county commissioners, they're going to set the per diems for poll workers. That's inspectors, poll judges, poll clerks, poll assistant clerks, poll sheriffs, as well as the vote center workers. And they're going to do that when they determine their budgets for election expenses. This makes sense, right? Because the commissioners need to know what the compensation is in order to determine how to budget election expenses overall as part of that bigger picture. And then the election board has a little bit of a more limited role in this sense, but they do get to set compensation for canvass clerical assistants and the write-in counting team. All right, we're going to talk real quickly about who is working on election day. Let's just jump right into it. We have maybe different categories of folks. So some people who will work on election day are already county employees and they're already on county payroll. How you process that in terms of reporting is going to be important. Again, I'm going to defer to Stacy on that. That's her part of the presentation at the end. But here we might be talking about county clerk deputies, other county employees, and other county elected officials. Now, when we're asked how election workers should be paid, we get this big, broad question all the time. It's not really a simple answer. It's going to depend on who is doing the election work. The first question we have to ask usually at the State Board of Accounts before we can help with that type of question is, who's doing the work? Are we talking about a county employee? Are we talking about somebody who works for a different unit of government? Or are we talking about just a citizen who doesn't work for any unit of government? When your deputies are working the election, all compensation received, including for election work, is going to be paid through payroll. And Stacy's going to get into that in detail. If you have other county employees who work the day of the election or the day of the primary, both elections, the election compensation gets combined with their regular compensation to determine if their election compensation has to be reported. And therefore, they have to be paid through payroll as well. In most cases, with folks who work for the county, really, I have to imagine in all cases, you're going to be over the thresholds for this. So Stacy's going to get more into that in a second. So, but when workers do not work for the county at any time other than elections, then you're looking at the compensation they're going to receive from the county for election work only to determine reporting requirements. If the person works for a different local government unit, we have a lot of folks who work for cities or schools or towns who volunteer their time. They work the polls and get paid on election day. They would still not be a county employee, so they would be treated the same as every other every other worker who worked only the election. I can mention the Canvas clerical assistant job. I don't know a lot about it. That question would probably be better directed to the election division. My understanding is it's really an optional job. It's really an assistant who helps with certain parts of the election. I don't know just because of my own ignorance, how many counties have canvas clerical assistants or use that position. I do think it's optional. But if you have questions about the sorts of duties they perform, you might want to ask the election division. There may also be other people who are on this call right now, clerks who use those folks, who would better be able to explain what they do. If you're asking me what they do on a day-to-day basis, I'm probably going to give you bad information. Um, so one of the complicating factors is we do have some employees at counties who are required to work the election, regardless of whether or not, not as a poll worker, but just because that's part of their regular job duty. When we have folks like that who are required to work on election day because that's their job responsibility, they don't get treated like county employees who would not otherwise work at the polls on election day. So, you may have some folks who are deputies in the clerk's office who are required to work on election day. If they are, that's part of their normal job duties. They're not going to get paid that per diem that's set by the commissioners in that context. But we do have some rules that are new. So last year, the General Assembly added a section to the Indiana Code 3-5-4-15. This is a new statute. And I think for most of you, maybe everybody, this is going to be the first election cycle since this statute went into effect. And what it says is that a county shall provide a paid day of leave to a county employee who requests leave to work at the polls on election day. And now, here in the sentence that I've drafted for this presentation, I wrote the word county because I'm talking to folks from counties. But in fact, this also applies to anybody who works for a city or a town or a township or a school. So any of those employees who would otherwise have to come to work at their city or town or county, if they want to work the polls on election day, their employer at the city, town, county, township, or school, they have to give them a paid day off. It's required by law. And this is in addition to any other benefit leave they would get. So that leave is in addition to something like PTO or vacation leave. They just get a paid day off to go work the polls. I think the idea here was to encourage folks to volunteer without having to sacrifice one of their days of vacation leave or to take an unpaid day. We want people to work. We want people to work at the polls on election day. So a really good intention there. Now, this law is not applicable to employees who are already required to work on election day. So here we're talking about people like sheriff's deputies, or again, maybe folks in the clerk's office who are required to work on election day regardless. They don't get an extra day of paid leave. That would be cool, but that's just not how that works. And just to clarify, if you are a county employee, you get this paid day off in addition to all of your other benefit leave. And then you also get that per diem if you choose to work the polls from the commissioner. So you get the paid day off and your normal compensation, and then you also get paid for working the polls, whatever dollar amount that is. So you get both. Okay, I think this is the point in the presentation where I'm going to turn it over to Stacy. But before I do that, I just want to check to see if there are any other questions people have real quick.
I
Okay.
don't see any in the chat right now, Mike, but if they come in, I can pause. If so, or I mean, you did most of the heavy lifting, so I'm just here to talk about taxes and reporting, the fun stuff, right, guys? So, Mike, if you want to go to the next slide for me. Just county employee get the paid. Heather, I might need you to clarify that for me. Sorry. But we can talk about taxes, and then Heather, once you clarify what your question is, then we'll get paid for the day off. Oh, Mike, that's for you.
Yeah. So again, so if you have a county employee, I guess Heather, jump in and clarify at any point if you have an additional question. But if you have a county employee who, goes to their supervisor and says, "I would like to work the polls," they're going to get a paid day off. So they're not going to show up and perform their normal duties. Don't worry, that's not ghost employment. It's allowed by statute. They're not going to show up at the county and perform their normal duties. They're going to get a paid day off work. So they'll get their compensation for whatever job they do for the county. And then they will also get that per diem from the commissioners that all regular poll workers get. I hope that answers your question. If that's not exactly it, let me know.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Okay, so taxes, the fun stuff. Election worker compensation. Mike, she had another follow-up. Would you like to
Yeah.
continue?
No, so yeah, so yes, school corporations. So there are, as Jennifer is pointing out, there are a lot of units of government, not all of them, but there are a lot of units of local government that already give primary election day and general election day as days off. So in that case, it's just not going to matter, right? Those folks already have the paid day off, so they don't get like an extra paid day off or something like that. They've already got it off. But for those units of government that don't offer it as a paid day off already, if somebody wants to work the polls, they automatically get it. Now, I don't know about teachers. That's a wonderful question, a really interesting question. School corporations are covered by that new statute, by the statute in Title III I cited earlier. Whether or not that covers teachers, I don't know. That's an interesting question, maybe to be posed to the election division as opposed to somebody else. So let's see. There's a question from Jenny there, Stacy. Do you want to
Yes, yes,
jump
I
in?
see that. And so Jenny's question is, my deputy would like to elect to take comp time rather than pay, but payroll said she has to take pay. So it really depends on your guys' county policy because it also depends on the type of employee that she is. So whenever I say that, it's either exempt or non-exempt. And comp time is more so. I have more questions for you, Jenny, so we might need to email outside because I feel like we're getting into a very specific space. Oh, and there's another statute that just popped up in the chat. But we might need to talk about that. Comp time is determined locally. So there's not a statute for comp time. So it depends on what your local policy is. So Jenny, I have more questions for you if you'd like to speak offline. And we can maybe figure out why payroll said she cannot have pay for that day. Mike, there was a follow-up to what about city employee?
Yeah, so city employees are also covered by 3-5-4-15. You see Mike popped it right into the chat there. So a city employee, if you get a call at the clerk's office from somebody at the city who asks you, hey, do I have to let my employee work the polls and do I have to give them a paid day off? The answer is yes. You have to, right? So it covers city employees, township employees, and school corporation employees. And again, the only exception are for those folks who are already required to work on election day as part of the operational function of election day or for public safety purposes. And I think when we say public safety purposes, we're really mostly talking about law enforcement personnel. There may be some other very limited categories, possibly professional firefighter, something like that. But for the most part, any city employee or town or township or school employee who wants to work the polls, their employer has to give them a paid day off so they can go work the polls.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Does anyone have any more questions on that? I'd like to talk about it while it's still fresh in our brains if anyone has any further questions on that. Doesn't look like it, but I'll give it another second. Okie dokie. Okay, now to the fun part, guys, taxes. Okay, I think there is a big misconception that election worker compensation is taxable, but it's not subject to income tax withholding. So I feel like there's a lot of confusion because people always think, oh, there shouldn't be taxes withheld on that. However, it's taxable, but it's just not subject to income tax withholding, no matter what the threshold is. So any pay for election work will not have income tax withheld on it. Okay. Just across the board, no income tax withheld on that. Even for those employees that are working the polls on those days, that election pay for working the polls will not have income tax withheld. Okay. Now, when we start talking about Social Security and FICA or Medicare, so we're talking about FICA, it only applies when the election workers' compensation is more than the federal threshold amount for the year. So in 2026, the federal threshold amount is $2,500. Okay, so we need to keep that amount for the federal threshold amount in our head because we're thinking 2,500. Okay. Employees can choose, Employers can choose either withhold FICA on every dollar earned, then issue a refund to election worker if compensation is less than the threshold. And when we say that threshold, that's the $2,500, okay? Or not withhold FICA until the threshold is met. County will then be liable for total FICA taxes due. Okay, so I feel like this is where there's a lot of confusion because I'm not talking about the $600 threshold right now. Okay, the $600 threshold is a reporting threshold. This slide is simply talking about the $2,500 for FICA withholdings. Okay, so if you have an election worker that makes less than $2,500, we don't withhold any FICA on that. Okay. So they're under the $2,500 threshold. However, if you have an election worker, like an employee, their FICA is going to be withheld automatically because they're an employee. So their employee earnings is already over probably the $2,500. So we need to make sure that FICA is withheld from that. I believe that the issue is with planning between which election workers will be working what days, how frequently they'll be working, and things like that. A lot of counties, I believe, whenever you guys start reaching out to us, is you had an employee that you categorized as not going to be over that $2,500 threshold. You thought that they were going to be under it. However, maybe they picked up some extra shifts on election day or stayed a little bit later. Therefore, it threw them into the $2,500. You guys typically get us involved in that instance when you say, I wasn't withholding FICA from the very first dollar. So what do I need to do moving forward? Well, you're going to have to calculate what is the amount of FICA that should have been withheld to that very first dollar. And whenever you do the next pay for them, the FICA withholding will be a little bit more because you're adjusting for recouping what FICA was not withheld previously. Okay. So that very first withholding amount for FICA, whenever you start withholding, it's going to be a lot because you didn't hold it previous. It looked like someone raised their hand and then took it away. So if you have a question, please just let us know. But you might have to, again, the clerk and the auditor are going to have to work together because if you do have an employee where you didn't categorize them as receiving over that $2,500, we're going to have to start withholding FICA. So you need to keep track of those election workers and make sure you know how to plan accordingly. Does anyone have questions? I know that's where we have almost all the questions whenever it comes to what taxes are withheld and not. I don't see anything. So I'm going to give it another minute just in case. Okay. Then I just did so good explaining that. Okay, I'm gonna, will we have access to the information after this meeting? Yes, you will. It's gonna be recorded and I will send back out the PowerPoint slides. And I also had to send out a flow chart initially too, to kind of help you guys. Our payroll software company told us that there is no way to go back and include FICA on previous payroll. So what are we to do? So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to do a manual adjustment. So if you, so Connie, if you started paying someone and not withholding because you didn't think they were going to go over the $2,500, what you're going to have to do is go in your pay. And I don't know if it's, again, I don't know how your guys's software works, but you should be able to do a manual adjustment for that FICA withholding. So you're going to have to calculate it outside. You're going to have to calculate the FICA that needs to be withheld from the current paycheck and then from all the other dollars previous to that, what should have been withheld. So that's why you're going to do a manual adjustment to that very first pay where you start withholding FICA, and it's going to look like a little bit more. And then the next pay will just be the regular FICA withholding for that very first pay. So you're going to have some documentation with that to support that pay because the FICA will look like it's a lot more withholding. Okay, Sorry, Paul, I didn't know you were responding to Connie. Explain the difference between the $2,500 threshold and the $600 threshold. So the $600 is the IRS reporting threshold for a W-2. Okay, that's all that $600 is. The $2,500 is the federal threshold for FICA withholdings. Okay, so they're different. So the $600 is saying anyone less than $600, W-2, no W-2 required. Okay, that's what it is. Over $600, W-2 is required by the IRS. The $2,500 threshold is when FICA needs to start being withheld. Okay. Will the video have the chat information included? I'm documenting all the questions that you guys have in the chat, and I plan on sending out the Q&A to those with the answers. So, Shelly, I will do my best to make sure that I get everything while I'm speaking included in the Q&A and sent out with the link to the video, okay? Paula, can we just pay them one time at the end so we know if we are holding for the correct person? Yes, if you want to do that, you can. It might make it easier because you got to go back to the very first dollar. So I guess then in a sense, you're calculating all FICA for all dollars if they're over the $2,500. We wouldn't take exception to that because again, you're withholding it for that individual. As long as the amount is calculated correctly, I don't think that would be an issue. The IRS is still getting the FICA withheld. So in that instance, that's easier. Okay, hold on. You guys are like blowing up the chat. 1 minute. If the county employee is, if it is a county employee, is it subject to income tax withholding? No. So that one is straight across the board. So income tax is not withheld from anything of payroll, of election payroll earnings, okay? Let's see. I explained the different. Okay, someone liked that. Shelly gave hard eyes. I love you guys in this chat. This is super fun. Okay. Yeah, okay. So yes, since employee earnings go way above 2,500. Okay. So okay, you guys are going very, very fast. 1 second. Are you talking pay once for spring and fall? I think that's maybe a question for Paula because Paula answered that. It could be. Connie, I think Paula was referring to at the very end of the year for all of them, but I'm not going to speak for Paula, so she can respond to you in the chat. But you could do a spring and fall calculation for FICA. However, in spring, you might not be over the threshold. You might be over it in fall. So you got to look at the whole year's worth of earnings. So is that only for FICA for county employees? So the FICA threshold amount, the $2,500, is only is for everybody for election. So employees of the county are automatically over the $2,500 because you're having to pay them through payroll. Okay, so it's total amount for the year. However, the FICA, the $2,500 threshold, is for all election workers. Okay, so that's how we need to think about that. It's for election pay. So if we just have someone that is an election worker, they're not an employee of the county, and they're over the $2,500 threshold, then we need to withhold FICA. A county employee is automatically over the FICA amount. So we are just starting automatically withholding FICA from theirs. However, we're not withholding state income tax, okay? Okay, I'm to Brittany's now. Okay, perfect. Okay, hold on. I need to scroll back up in the chat. Okay, here, I'm going to move the chat over here so I can see it better. Okay, where did it go? For our county, if you aren't a county employee, they go through our claims process. Okay, is this okay regardless if they make more than 2,500? If you are a county employee, regular taxes are taken out. Okay, so what we need to think about, you're now starting to talk about how we're going to pay them, okay? And I haven't gotten there yet. So Brittany, I might answer your question. Can I answer your question after I go through payment methods? Because I think that'll be easier, okay? So I'm going to come back to Brittany Boyd. Teresa, if a full-time county employee works during the election, is the $2,500 threshold separate from their regular FICA? No. So it's all compensation from the county. So we're putting election pay and their regular salary all together. And so we're withholding FICA no matter what, since they're a county employee. Okay. Paula, per the IRS and Social Security, is it a total for the year? I don't know if that's a statement or a question, Paula. Oh, it is a total for the year. So it's total compensation. Um, if county employees get paid in comp time for working elections, is the comp time subject to income withholding? So typically comp time is paid out at a different point in time. Mike, would you agree on that one? I'm not sure if you've read
Yeah, so
that.
so it's I think I'm understanding the question. If you have a county employee who is not otherwise required to work on election day who wants to be a poll worker, you have to just give them the day off, right? So
Mhm.
it's I don't understand the comp time question there. That's a little bit interesting to me. But if you have a county employee, so is that how you're understanding it, Stacy? Or are we talking about people who are required to work election day and thus get comp time because they work over a certain number of hours? How are you understanding the question?
I think I'm understanding it as if the election worker has to work election day but gets comp time for those hours when working. I think the question is when it's paid out, is is income withheld? Is that how okay,
Yeah.
hold on. She responded, we pay comp time to county employees because they get that day off. So Mike, I think your
Yeah.
interpretation was correct.
Yeah. So in the event, I'm going to go all the way down the rabbit hole here. In the event somebody has a comp time bank and it ends up getting paid out when they separate from the county or at a point in time down the road. This is an IRS question, so you'll want to verify it with the IRS, but I think that is subject to income tax withholding. Again, you're going to want to check with the IRS because that is a real specific question about it. So do not take our word for that one.
Okay, and
Because
Mike,
usually, right, you can't tell what the comp time was for. You're going to have a bucket of comp time. So anyway.
that's just a comp time bucket, yeah. So it just goes into a pool and you use it. I don't think we're gonna say, oh, that's the comp time you earned on election day. I don't, it doesn't normally work like that unless your
Yeah.
guys' software system identifies it, but most of them don't. It's
And
just comp time.
we're talking about employees who are required to work election day in that context already, right? So okay.
Yes, yes. So I think, Mike, I think there's another one Heather had talking about taxes for county employees. They don't take our taxes for working election day, right? I just thought about that. Is she talking about taxes? Oh, hold on. She's down here too. In other words, do they get withheld taxes from working election day pay from regular day off? Okay, Heather, I think, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. The way I'm reading her question is if employee works on election day, are we talking about election work or regular duties, Heather? Mike, do you understand
Yeah,
it, which one that is?
I don't, and I think so election work. So if
Okay,
they choose to be a poll worker, they're going to get the day off paid for their regular day off, and they're going to get their poll worker salary, and you do not withhold, Stacy, correct me if I'm wrong, you do not withhold income tax, but you
mhm.
would be doing the FICA.
Yes, you're correct. Heather, did that clear that up? Okie dokie. Connie, for county employees, we set up a second pay record, which I think a lot of you set up a second pay record for their election pay. Did not withhold federal, state, or county taxes. We only withheld FICA. Is that correct? So we're talking state income tax wouldn't be withheld. So FICA includes Social Security and Medicare. So when we're talking about FICA, that's what we're talking about. So you don't withhold income tax, so that's state income tax, but you do withhold FICA. Did I answer that question? I guess I don't know. We'll wait 1 minute. Okay, perfect. Okay, I have Denise. That's the last question I think I have. We pay comp time to county employees because they get the day off. I think we've already answered that, Denise. I think Mike maybe just answered that.
Yep.
What about county tax? I don't think county tax. would be included in that. Do you, Mike?
I don't believe it is. Again, if you want
Uh-uh.
100% clarity on that, though, you would
That's an
want to talk to,
IRAs.
yeah,
Yeah. And we
talk to
we will try and
field.
find out. Okay. Is income tax federal, state, and county?
Yeah, that's the same kind of
Yes.
question, right?
Yes.
It also is not withheld, is my understanding. Again, though,
Yes.
if you
That's
want
my yes. No, you're
100%
Mike, you're
clarity,
right.
I think that's a DOR question, right? For income taxes.
County is an income tax. So I would say no. Yes, Amy. We're all, so really the only thing we're withholding is Social Security, Medicare. So those that are looped into FICA. That's how kind of Mike and I understand it. Okay, I knew this would be the fun part. Oh, okay. What payroll software allow you to shut off deductions on dates of pay and pay lines in the same pay? We use Lao. Does someone else have different that allows this to shut off and on each line? I will let anyone answer Paula because it looks like she's trying to poll people in the audience. So she might need a name to get in contact with later. So Paula, I'll let you guys do that in the chat. I'm going to start talking about payment for services, okay? Go ahead, Mike. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so payment to election workers. Let's talk about the methods of payment. So the PRE2, the statement of expenses, precinct election officers, workers on election day, specified on this form. This form was also updated, I believe, last year. So that's just some food for thought for you guys. There is a new form out there. Another payment method is the Form 17, so the claim form, and then through payroll, okay? Amounts must tie to an amount approved by appropriate board. So as Mike talked about earlier in this presentation, which boards set which per diems, pay rates, things like that. So whenever we're coming in and we're auditing, we're making sure that they are being compensated in the amount that was set by the board and included on the salary ordinance, okay? It must be within appropriation, so it must be budgeted for. There has to be an appropriation for it. And any changes in compensation must be approved by the appropriate board. So, like Mike said, depending on what compensation we're talking about, if it was changed during the year, which I'm not talking about like the elected officials, I'm talking about the other election workers. If they change their compensation during the year, then we would expect to see that amended on the salary ordinance and changed and everything flow through from that. Okay. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a copy of the form, and then we are going to, I'll just kind of talk about it a little bit more. But on this one, this is the PRE2. This is the new version of the form. So if I recently talked to election division because there was a county asking if they could use the old PRE2, which really the new form, all it did was expand the columns to the right. So the dark gray columns that say election pay, meal pay, training pay, total, these columns were expanded because there only was one in the previous form. So in my conversations with Angie over at Election Division, if a county is using an old form like this, then again, you can use that form. This new form is just more so like giving more detail. I think it's kind of what you guys requested for. But this is just for those people that are only working on election day. We're not talking about county employees on this form, okay? Um, Amy, method of payment. Payroll claim would only include county employees. So and I believe there actually is a fillable version of this. This is a state form. So, Daryl, if you actually go on to the state form's website and you type in the state form number 47432, this should bring up that form. And I believe it's either a fillable PDF or an Excel version of it. Okay. Destry, you were wanting the one. Okay. it made doing their payroll easier, which that makes sense. It's totally up to you guys. Angie talked about this form and I told her it makes no difference to us. So if you guys want to use the old form, then you can. I didn't see any major significant changes. This form just kind of broke it down a little bit more. So again, from our audit perspective, as long as we can see who you're paying, the rate of pay, and that they were paid appropriately and from the correct fund, it's not something we're going to take exception to. Again, election division talked about grandfathering in the old form too, and you could use both depending on whatever is easiest for you. Amy, for method of payment, payment claim would only include county employees. So you're correct. However, you're correct in county employees have to be paid through payroll. Okay. However, some counties have opted to also pay all employees through payroll. So yes and no. That's not a very clear answer to you, but it really depends on what you guys want to do at the county level. Some counties have opted into paying everyone through payroll. You don't have to. However, for W-2 reporting, it makes it a lot easier if they are paid through payroll because you know that anyone paid through payroll is going to get a W-2. Okay. For those employees that make less than $600, no W-2 is required. So you could pay them through the PRE2 or you could pay them through a payroll claim or a claim. Mike, can you go to the next slide? That's the claim.
Yes, and I did also want to clarify for
Yeah.
Daryl that there is a fillable version of that form. Stacy was right. So,
Oh, perfect. I thought so. I just couldn't remember. I thought I'd see things. So who knows where I saw that. So thank you, Mike, for verifying that. Okay. So for the payroll voucher, so the PRE2 and the payroll voucher that's on your, or this is just the claim form, not the payroll voucher. My bad. The payroll voucher is on the next slide. I was jumping ahead. The claim form and the PRE2, you can pay people that make less than $600 with this form. Okay. This form and then the claim form. So might go to the claim form. So you can pay, we can't though pay employees with the claim form. Can you go back one slide? Sorry. Yep, this one. I want the claim voucher. So we're talking about employees that are less than $600 because there's no W-2 reporting requirements. However, you also have that weird range between more than $600 and less than $2,500. Okay. So remember, $600 is the W-2 reporting and $2,500 is the federal FICA withholding amount. So you could have people that are in this middle range. Okay. And if you have people within this middle range, I would recommend you can either, I want to look this up before. You can choose how you want to pay them. However, you need to do a W-2 for these employees, okay? So the problem is if you don't run these people that are in the middle range, more than 600, less than 2,500, they have to get a W-2. If you prepare a claim for them, how are you going to remember to prepare a W-2 for them? Okay, so you might need to have additional controls in place to do that. Okay. If you pay election workers through a claim, wouldn't that cause them to get a 1099? Not necessarily, because remember, when we were talking initially, the 1099s, that requirement is an IRS requirement for contractors. And in this instance, we are considering election workers employees in this context, okay? And they have to get a W-2. That's what the IRS says. So there
and
is no 1099. If
and
you
that's
pay
the
them through a
weird.
claim, go ahead, Mike.
No, sorry, I was going to say that's the weird world we live in with election workers. It feels like they would get a 1099, Mackenzie, but the IRS says they don't. So, they're not, they get paid. If you pay them through a claim, it feels like you're paying an independent contractor and it's a 1099, but this is one of
Mm-hmm.
those ways that election workers are unlike other people. So,
Yes, thank you,
sorry for
Mike.
interrupting. Yeah.
fine. I think it's a great point to make because again, we're having to categorize them for this presentation so that you guys know what the reporting requirements are. So again, I would recommend if they're over that $600 and they have to receive a W-2, it's easier to probably pay them through payroll instead of paying them through claim, because what's going to trigger you to remember that? If you have an internal control process in place where you're paying them through claim and you're also preparing them a W-2, then that's fine. You can totally do that. We pay their meals through the claims process and then their election pay through payroll. Mackenzie, I think that that's a perfect way to do that because it's triggering you to do a W-2. Is a W-2 needed for individuals who make less than $600? No, no. A W-2 is not needed for individuals who make less than $600. Connie, I don't know how we would agree, how we would prepare a W-2 if they are not paid in the payroll software. So for those over 600, we proceed through payroll instead of APV. And Connie, I think that's a very good way to do that because your system will say, hey, I need to create a W-2 for this person, and they're not getting missed. So I think it's easier to pay them through payroll and it prepares a W-2 for them. Will we need a W-4 filled out for the election workers if they will be receiving a W-2 at the end of the year, even if they will not have income tax deducted? That's an IRS form. And Mike, I'm not 100% certain on a W-4. So I would recommend reaching out to the IRS. I think you need the information on a W-4 for payroll purposes, but I'm not certain.
Yeah, I'm not certain about that either. I don't, I'm not certain. You'll want to reach out
So
to the IRS. I'm not
yeah, so
comfortable even
Myra, that's a
speculating
very
on
good
that one.
question. Myra, that's a good question. We will write that down, see if we can find an answer. However, it might be IRS guidance, and I don't want to give guidance on their behalf, okay? Okay, Todd, if they are paid via payroll, we will prepare a W-2 regardless. Uh, if they are paid via payroll, yes. So if you prepare a W-2, you just have to weed out those individuals that make less than $600. So you might have to implement another safeguard or an internal control in place to make sure that you're not issuing W-2s to people less than $600. I think that answers your question, Todd. Accounts payable voucher is used, accounts payable voucher is used for, I am new at this. So the APV, so the claim form that we're looking at, this is how all claims are paid through the county, Heather. So typically payroll is not included on this. Mike, could you go to the next slide, please? The next slide is a payroll voucher. So when we talk about vouchers, we either talk about a claims voucher or a payroll voucher. Payroll vouchers will include all compensation for like employees of the county. They should be paid on a payroll voucher. Jenny, if we pay a per diem for meals, does it calculate in with their pay or is it considered a reimbursement versus pay? Mike, I don't think that that's compensation, but I would like your brain.
Yeah, I don't think that we would consider that compensation either. That's going to be the sort of thing that's determined by local policy, almost, like a travel policy or something like that. So, that would not be something that would be included with compensation. Would you agree with that, Stacy?
Yes, I would agree. Okay, I think the last one I see is Dottie. If the worker wants taxes to be withheld, would we be wrong to withhold? Um, well, income tax doesn't need to be withheld. However, FICA does. So if they want more taxes withheld, I think, Mike, would they just get it back? This is a question I do not know the answer to off the top of my head.
Yeah, so sometimes with the Form W-4, you can direct a certain withholding. Maybe that's what Dottie's talking about. Again, I don't know that there's a firm answer to this question, and I certainly don't think our agency is the right agency to answer this
Yeah.
question. I will tell you, my instinct is always, with election workers, this is already really complicated. they're already sort of being treated differently than the categories of folks we're used to dealing with when we're talking about paying local government employees. When you add even additional complications like you're suggesting, Dottie, that makes me even more nervous when you start to, add complications within complications. So you'll want to talk to the IRS about whether or not you're breaking any rules in that sense, but I would want to treat them all the same if I could, and not do the withholding because the withholding isn't required. But again, you'll want to ask the IRS if you get somebody who's really insistent that you withhold some amount of federal income tax from their election pay.
Okie dokie. So Paula, should election workers be paid on the payroll vouchers? These are the people working early voting and canvassing prior to election day. Um, and poll working that I'm asking about, not the clerk office county employees. So we're talking about if we need to pay election workers through the payroll voucher. Again, I think it depends on the dollar. So are we talking about county employees other than the clerk's office, or are we also talking about people who are just poll workers less than, okay. So Mike, I think I have Paula's question now. So we're talking about people who are not county employees, but payroll, or let's just say those election workers, and that's all that they're doing, right, Paula? Yes, election only. So well, how much are they making? That's a big factor here. So if the county decides to run them all through payroll, you could do that. They would show up then on the payroll voucher. However, if they're less than $600 and you don't need a W-2, I'd say maybe paying them via claim or PRE2 is your easiest option, running them other than running them through payroll. But that's a county decision. So I don't know how to answer your question perfectly because it's your decision how you want to do that. You just need to make sure the proper taxes aren't withheld. Did I answer that okay? Or well enough for you, Paula? Okay. Okay. So I feel like I've kind of answered this. I feel like I've answered this question through and through, but why we're looking at the payroll schedule voucher. County employees have to be paid through this because, again, we're not, they're still employees. They need a W-2. Those people over $2,500, they're going to need a W-2. Those over 600, less than 2,500, they're going to need a W-2. So you could use this payroll voucher for that as well. I'm not going to spend any more times on the forms. Mike, if you want to go to the next slide, which is reporting, and then the next slide. Okay, so reporting, we have talked about this so much, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. However, I wanted you to see it in writing. No reporting requirements for those workers making less than $600. Okay, so no 1099 is required, no W-2 is required. There's no reporting requirements for people, election workers that make less than $600. However, a W-2 is required when election workers make more than $600 and employees working elections. Okay, so could you go to the next slide, please? Um, Ricky and I made election payroll flow chart. I want to say about 2 years ago. I have updated it. I sent it to the associations with the presentation slides. So you guys have this as a PDF. This is helpful. If you guys are very visual learners and you want to know like which category of employee, who needs what and what needs to be withheld, things like that. This is a good resource, and just if reading the materials isn't helpful. So I will resend this out as well. Tammy asked a question, is the I-9 required for early voting workers? Mike, I don't know off the top of my head what's on the I-9.
I think that's like a employment eligibility verification form from the IRS. So yeah, I hate to keep saying this. I think that's an
Yes.
IRS question. Um, if you give me a minute, I can see if there's some very clear guidance from the IRS on that particular question. And I did
So
also just want to say to Marissa's comment, like, this flow chart for me when I was first looking at this issue, this is an incredible tool. So reference it frequently that you put together, Stacy. So really good
Um,
work with this flow chart.
oh, perfect. Thank you. I'm glad everyone likes it. I'm very visual. Okay, hold on. So the I-9, so I-9, okay, would be need to process payroll most likely. Thank you for confirming that. So again, if they're being paid through payroll, then you probably need that I-9. So sorry, I can't say for sure, but you might need to double check. It sounds like a lot of people are saying yes to that. Okay, hold on. Can elected officials receive a per diem and work the polls? So for that question, which are we talking about the per diem amount set for like the clerk or something, or what elected officials and what per diem? Jenny, that might be a more specific question and we might not have time to answer, so you might want to email Mike and I. Connie, I believe that Lao has an option to filter out those that do not make over 600 to not produce a W-2. If we pay them through payroll, I would need to confirm that. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, thank you. Can a 1099 be issued to election workers making more than 600 and paid through the claims process and not through payroll? Okay, the $600 is the reporting threshold for the IRS. And they're saying any money over $600 has to have a W-2, not a 1099. So anyone who makes over $600, just election worker, obviously county employee, you have to issue W-2s for them. So a 1099 will not suffice. Um, okay, did I get all the questions that were in the chat? I think so. So
I think you
Mike,
did.
either you can go back to the QR code slide. I'm gonna put the QR code in the chat. Please, if you have not signed in for this presentation, please do so before 11:30. That way you guys get the 1.5 hours of credit for this training, okay? Okay, Jackson County Auditor, I would think if you pay through payroll, you need them to fill out a W-4 and an I-9, all the normal onboarding tax forms. Possibly, but I would like to preface, don't do all onboarding. Please don't do all onboarding. This will make your election workers not want to work because they don't need all onboarding required by the county. So just be careful with this. You do need the IRS forms so that you can pay them through payroll if you choose to. However, I would recommend not doing the whole onboarding process, okay? Um, yes. Okay. So, I think I answered all the questions in the chat. I'm gonna leave the QR code up, and Mike, I'm just gonna start running through the Q&A that we had that collected prior to conference, if that's okay. And you
Sounds
please stop
perfect.
me. Stop me. I'm gonna let you answer one of them, and I will let you know when. So, um, do we pay all election workers through payroll? If they just work election day and make less than $600, do we pay those through claims for a 1099 and not payroll with a W-2? Do we withhold federal taxes? I feel like I've answered this question a lot, so I'm not going to answer it right now because we have talked about it so in-depthly. But just quickly, remember reporting requirements. So election, it depends how much the person is making to trigger if we need a W-2. So no, election workers can be paid through claim or payroll. This is a county decision. If the election worker makes less than 600, they can be paid by claim, and there is no reporting requirement because it is less than 600. A 1099 is not required. FICA and income tax would not be withheld for those people making less than $600, okay? The next question we had was on taxes. I want to refer you just to slide 18 because it talks about taxes specifically. Income tax income is taxable, however, not subject to income tax withholding. As for FICA, so Social Security and Medicare taxes, you have options. You either withhold it from the very first dollar it was earned and refund them if they're under the threshold, so that under the $2,500, or you do not withhold FICA until they meet the $2,500 threshold, and then you recoup the FICA from the very first dollar. Okay. Um, Number three, what if you have a county employee who is also going to be paid for election work, but doesn't work in the clerk's office? Taxed differently, we use LAO. Would we create another pay record? I think you guys can create another pay record for that election work. So I can't really speak to that, but from talking with you guys, it sounds like you are able to do that. Um, so they are an employee and they make over the threshold of $2,500. So income tax is not withheld on election pay. However, FICA would be withheld and they are over the limit. So that one's pretty easy. Someone asked about the recording of this training. We are recording this. I will end the session, have like the first 15 minutes cut out as we were kind of doing the housekeeping items. And then we will post it to our YouTube channel and send you guys out the link with Q&A, the video, the PDF of the presentation, and also that flow chart for you guys, and we'll send it to the associations as well. How do you handle individuals that do not want to take any payment as they just want to volunteer their time? Mike, I'm going to let you answer that one.
Yeah, what an interesting question. I don't know of any rule that would prohibit somebody from refusing to accept the dollars or asking to volunteer their time so they wouldn't get paid. Uh, Here's what I would say. First off, if you're going to do this, absolutely make sure you get something in writing because you would hate to have this be confusing after the fact with somebody who says, "Hey, actually, I did want to get paid," or you would hate to have it look confusing if one of our field examiners comes in and says, wait, this doesn't seem to be, your payroll doesn't seem to be right. So you want to have it in writing. That said, again, you can decide whether or not you want to do this. I would caution against it. As I said before, paying election workers is already a complicated task. And if you say, well, we're going to pay some election workers and we're not going to pay others and we're going to treat them as volunteers, that's even one additional complication. So just for ease of administration, it feels like you should treat everybody the same in this regard and pay everybody who's going to work the polls. Again, I don't know of any rule that prohibits it, but certainly get documentation if you're going to allow it and think hard about whether or not that's the sort of thing you want to allow at your county.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. The next question was, if the election worker works 4 separate pay periods and I turn off the FICA on the first pay, but by the end they meet the threshold, how would you go back and collect the amounts? You'd have to do that. You'd have to recalculate that amount like we talked about previous, back to the very first dollar that so because they're over that $2,500. At this point, that's when it needs to be turned on. So if you weren't already taking out FICA, then you'd have to go back, recalculate, go in, make that a manual adjustment for that first FICA withdrawal. And then after, you would just take out the standard FICA amount after you've recouped all of the FICA that you need to from back to the very first dollar. And if you have further questions on that, that's one where I would say send Mike and I a detailed email about what the situation is. If you want us to help you figure that out, we can totally do that. We've done that in the past. So that makes it easier when we have all the information. Number 7, do the election deputy and chief deputy receive pay for hours worked on election day? This really depends on the county. And the reason I say that is if your election deputy and chief deputy duties include working on election day, then it's just another day. Okay, it could be overtime comp time if the county has election day off. However, if the county does not have election day off, then it is just another working day. So some counties you guys get it off, some you guys don't. So I mean, case by case basis, I would say if you have questions, clerks, auditors, please email us and we will help you figure it out. It's best to figure it out before you have to pay them because you don't want to hold up someone's pay. Okay. So especially if they're receiving comp time or overtime for that day, make sure you have a plan prior to election day, and that election payroll running. So you know, again, where those deputies lie. Okay. Um, number 8, how are you to know who to withhold FICA and federal taxes from when we don't know if they can meet the threshold? I feel like we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to go over that one again, but I will put the answer to that question in the Q&A that when we send it out, okay? Um, Number 9, can we just use the same payroll system for election workers as we do for county workers? Do we have to use the PRE2 or the claim form if our system has all of the required information? You can run them all through payroll. That's a county decision. You can totally do that. We've talked about that multiple times during this presentation. You don't have to use the claim form and the PRE2. You just need to make sure if an employee is making less than the $2,500 threshold, to not withhold FICA. If they're making over the $2,500, withhold FICA. So you just have to pay more attention to what the withholdings are for those individuals, and things like that. But it's totally up to you guys. Or if they make less than $600, then you're not providing a W-2. Okay. So you just need to make sure you're aware of those. Number 10, do county employees working the election on election day? Okay, I'm going to start rereading this one. Mike and I were confused. So if this was your question, please chime in. Do county employees working the election on election day, but not at the polls, get the additional pay? So it's not precisely clear which county employees we're talking about in this scenario, so it might be helpful to have a little bit more detail. But assuming we're talking about employees in, for example, the clerk's office, who are required to work on election day as part of their regular duties, such as employees would not receive the per diem that's paid to poll workers. Mike and I think we answered that question appropriately. However, if we misunderstood it, please let us know. And the last question that I have is, for 2026, the IRS 1099 threshold has increased to $2,000. Can you confirm if this applies to election workers as well, or if they still follow the $600 threshold? So just a caveat to this, remember, election workers are considered employees by the IRS for reporting purposes. So they're not independent contractors. So a 1099 is not used. The IRS requires a W-2 for an election worker making more $600 or more. Anything less than $600 does not require a W-2 or 1099. Mike, were there any other questions that came in that I missed in the chat?
I think we've had one more. Did we answer Mackenzie's question from that was sent in at 11:20? We are closed during primary and election day. So if a county employee chooses to work the election, we would pay them the holiday pay for the day off plus the election worker pay. Again, the words holiday pay, I don't think we answered that one. Did we, Stacy?
No, we did not yet.
Yeah. Holiday pay can mean lots of different things depending on the context. Sometimes that means you get like an extra premium for showing up at work on a day that every other county employee has off. If that's what you mean by holiday pay, no, right? They would just get the day off and then they would get their election worker per diem. But if you mean, do they still get a paid day off? Like everybody else at the county, like any other holiday as a paid day off, like Christmas Day or something like that. Yes, they would still get that day off. And okay, great. They would get the paid day off, and then they would also get the per diem that's established by the commissioners. So yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Mike, you can stop sharing your screen. It looks like we've had everyone sign in with a QR code. I will turn on my camera. It seems like you guys really loved this training, so I love that you loved it. Mike and I, again, we love talking election payroll, and we could do it all day. Sometimes we do that all day. So we're having a lot of fun over here. So if you guys, again, have any other questions, please don't hesitate. You can drop them in the chat, but I don't want to keep you guys any longer because it's already been an hour and a half. And I feel like we had a lot of good content, a lot of great questions. I will try within this week to get the video out to you guys, presentation materials, hopefully Q&A. I can't promise that one will come that fast, so it might be next week. Mike, it looked like we had one come in, but I don't know if it's a question for us. Mackenzie, here's our county. We get paid day off and holiday pay for it. Then if you work at the polls, we would pay our employees holiday pay and pay for working the polls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if that's your local policy, that's fine. There's no
Yeah.
statutory requirement for it. So when we're talking about that new statute that requires a paid day off for folks who want to work the polls, there's nothing about holiday premium pay in there. That's going to be locally determined.
Yes. Hold on. Okay. We answered that Q&A that was in the chat, so we're good on that one. Doesn't look like we have anything else. I will let you guys go. Have a great week. Happy Easter to all of those who celebrate, and we will see you at your guys' conferences. So talk soon. Bye guys. Thank you.